It is 23 minutes past 1 in the morning, April 26th, 1986. In the control room of reactor number 4, a small team of engineers is running a safety test. A routine one. They want to know what happens if the power fails, whether the reactor's own dying momentum can keep the cooling pumps turning long enough for the backup generators to wake. The test is already going wrong. The power has dropped too low. The reactor is unstable, sluggish, half poisoned by its own gases. To bring it back, the operators pull the control rods almost all the way out. For a few seconds, the machine holds. Then it begins to climb. The power does not rise. It leaps. In 4 seconds, the reactor is producing more than 10 times the energy it was built to release. The fuel channels rupture. Water flashes instantly into steam. At 1:23 and 44 seconds, the operators press the emergency shutdown, the button that is supposed to stop everything. The rods begin to lower, and for one fatal instant, because of a flaw nobody in that room has been told about, they make the reaction faster, not slower. The first explosion lifts the lid of the reactor. A circular steel plate weighing more than 1,000 tons rises into the air, turns, and drops back at an angle. The second explosion throws burning graphite across the roof and out into the night. The sky above the plant turns a color no one has a name for. Crimson, and then a kind of blue. The men who see it from the town nearby will say it was almost beautiful. They do not know that they are looking at the inside of a reactor. They do not know that the air they are breathing now will decide how long they live. 40 years have passed since that night. The fire was buried. The town was emptied. A wall was drawn around a piece of the earth, and the world was told, simply, that no one could go there anymore. And yet, someone is there. People wake inside that wall this morning. They light their stoves. They feed their chickens. Wolves move through the streets of the empty city. A herd of wild horses grazes past a road sign shaped like a warning. The most contaminated landscape in Europe was supposed to be a grave. Instead, it became something stranger, something alive. This is Chernobyl. The name belongs to a small town in northern Ukraine, 100 kilometers above the capital, Kiev. In Ukrainian, it is spelled Chernobyl, and the word is older than the disaster, older than the reactor, older than the Soviet Union that built it. It comes from a plant, a kind of wormwood that grows wild along the riverbanks here. But the name the world remembers is not the town. It is the line drawn around it, the exclusion zone. 2,500 square kilometers of forest and marsh and abandoned villages, sealed off in the spring of 1986 and never reopened. An area larger than Luxembourg, fenced and guarded and left to itself. For most people, the picture ends there, a dead place, a silent place, a wasteland frozen on the day everyone ran. But the picture is wrong, and the people who could tell you so are still living inside the wall. Drive the cracked roads north from the checkpoint, past the rusting signs, and you will come to villages that the maps describe as empty. They are not. In a wooden cottage with a blue-painted gate, a kettle is boiling. A garden has been dug and planted. An old woman is feeding a cat that should not, by any official account, exist. They call her kind the samosely. The word means self-settlers, and the people who carry it never liked it. It suggests a squatter, a trespasser, someone who came where they did not belong. But these are not settlers. They were born here. Their parents are buried in the churchyard down the lane. They are not settling the land. They are coming home. The Ukrainian poet Lena Kostenko spent years among them, and she argued the word should be thrown out entirely. She offered a better one: povertancy, the returners. In the weeks after the explosion, more than 350,000 people were moved out of this region, whole towns loaded onto buses, and almost as soon as the buses left, a trickle of people began coming back. They came on foot, at night, past the soldiers and the wire. By the end of 1987, around 1,200 of them had slipped back into their old houses and refused to leave again. The authorities tried to remove them. They sent officials, warnings, threats. One old woman, faced with a man telling her she had to go, is supposed to have answered him plainly. "Shoot us," she said. "Shoot us and dig the grave. Otherwise, we are staying." They stayed. Most of them were women, grandmothers, the babushkas of the zone, who had already buried husbands, survived a famine, lived through a war. They had been hungry before. They had been afraid before. Radiation was an enemy they could not see, could not smell, could not fight. And to them, somehow, that made it less frightening than the thing the government was offering instead. A concrete apartment in a strange city, far from the only ground they had ever known. Ivan Semenyuk was one of the few men among them. He came back to the village of Pripyat in the winter of 1988, with his wife, to the house he had built. When he left, Pripyat had 600 people in it. The last time anyone counted, it had 3. He would sit in his small front room and remember the night of the explosion, the glass shaking in the window frames before they ever heard the sound. He grew his own potatoes. He kept bees. He lived by every measurement a scientist could take in a place where he should not have been able to live at all. Life in the villages is life as it was a century ago. There is no running water. The returners draw it from their own wells. They heat their houses with wood and grow what they eat in their own gardens, the same dark soil the scientists warn against, planted with potatoes and beans and cabbage, because that is what the ground has always given. A van comes when it can, bringing bread and salt and the small pension the state pays them for living where they live. The wild mushrooms and berries of the forest, which soak up radiation more than almost anything else here, are the one temptation they are told to resist, and do not always. They live, in other words, off the contaminated land, deliberately, by choice, trading an invisible risk for the only life they recognize as their own. And here is the detail that stays with you. Between 1986 and the early years of the last decade, the official records for the Chernobyl zone counted more than 900 deaths inside it, and exactly 1 birth. A community that does not replace itself, a village that only grows older. The returners came home to die where they had lived, and the wall around them slowly became the boundary of a single, fading generation. To understand why they would choose that, why anyone would, you have to go to the place they could not bear to leave. And to do that, you have to enter the city the reactor killed. Pripyat does not look like a ruin from a distance. It looks like a city waiting for its people to come back. Tower blocks stand in neat rows against the sky. The streets run straight and wide. Only when you come closer do you see the trees growing through the pavement, the saplings pushing up through the floors of the apartments, the forest quietly dismantling the place, one root at a time. Pripyat was built in 1970, 3 kilometers from the plant, to house the people who ran it. It was a model Soviet town, modern, clean, proud. The average age of its residents was 26. It had schools and swimming pools, a cinema, a hospital, a cultural palace, 15 cafes, a river port. It was the kind of place a young engineer was lucky to be sent. By the spring of 1986, almost 50,000 people lived there. On the morning after the explosion, they woke to an ordinary Saturday. Children went outside to play. A wedding was planned. The town had a new amusement park, and its centerpiece, a bright yellow Ferris wheel, was due to open in 5 days, on the 1st of May. It never turned for the public. Not once. For 36 hours, the people of Pripyat were told nothing. They could see the plant smoking. Some stood on a railway bridge at the edge of town to watch the strange light over the reactor, not knowing that the air on that bridge carried a dose that would kill. But no warning came. The state did not want a panic. It did not want the world to know. Then, on the afternoon of the 27th, the announcement comes over the radio. Attention, attention, an accident has occurred at the Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station. For your safety, a temporary evacuation is being organized. Take documents, necessary items, and food for 3 days. 3 days. 1,200 buses arrive from Kiev. In a few hours, the entire city is loaded aboard and driven out through the forest. People leave the dishes in the sink. They leave the beds unmade, the toys on the floor, the photographs on the walls. They lock their doors out of habit and put the keys in their pockets. 3 days, they were told. None of them ever lived there again. Walk through Pripyat now, and the evidence of that promise is everywhere. A child's gas mask on a classroom floor. There were thousands of them, civil defense stock, scattered by looters long ago. A piano with its keys gone yellow. A swimming pool drained, its diving board still bolted above the empty blue tiles. And on the edge of town, the Ferris wheel, rust orange now, motionless, the most photographed object in the entire zone. A wheel that carried no one, standing exactly where it stood the day the city died. It is very quiet here. That is the thing people remember most. Not the danger. You cannot feel the danger. The quiet. A city built for 50,000 voices, holding none. Not every village in the zone still stands the way Pripyat does. Some were judged too poisoned to leave above ground at all. Kopachi, close to the plant, was bulldozed entirely, its houses pushed into pits and buried, so that today only grass-covered mounds and a single surviving kindergarten mark where a community used to be. And beneath the hospital in Pripyat, in a basement room, lie the uniforms the first firefighters wore the night they climbed the reactor roof. 40 years on, those clothes are still so radioactive that to stand among them for long would be dangerous. The cloth remembers the fire. So how did it happen? How does a reactor run by trained engineers tear itself apart in the space of a few seconds? The machine at the heart of Chernobyl was a type called the RBMK. It was large, cheap, and powerful, and it had a flaw built into its very design. In most reactors, when the core heats up and the water inside it boils, the reaction slows down on its own. The steam acts as a brake. The RBMK was the opposite. When its water turned to steam, the reaction sped up. Heat made more heat. The brake was an accelerator. For most of the time, careful operation kept that tendency in check. But on the night of the test, the operators had pushed the reactor into exactly the state where that flaw could take hold. Low power, almost no water, the control rods drawn nearly all the way out. And then there was the final detail. The control rods, the ones meant to absorb the reaction and shut it down, were tipped with graphite. Graphite does the opposite of absorbing. For the first few seconds, as the rods descend, they speed the reaction up before they slow it down. The engineers in that room had never been told this. It was a state secret. So when they pressed the emergency button, the one action that should have saved them, they lit the fuse. The reactor surged, the channels burst, and the steam tore the building open from the inside. What followed was not the work of one machine breaking. It was the work of thousands of people trying to contain it, and many of them paid for it with their lives. The first to arrive were the firefighters. They came from Pripyat and the surrounding stations in the dark, in their ordinary uniforms, to fight what they believed was an ordinary fire on the roof of a power station. No one told them the burning chunks of black rock scattered around their feet were pieces of a reactor core. One of them is Vasily Ignatenko. He is 25 years old. He is strong, a former athlete, well-liked, recently married. He climbs to the roof of the turbine hall in the worst hours of the night and works to stop the flames from spreading to the other reactors. He kicks the glowing graphite away with his boots. He carries his fellow firemen down when they collapse. By morning, he cannot stand. Within hours, he and the others are flown to a special hospital in Moscow. The doses they absorbed are beyond anything medicine can treat. Their skin darkens. Their bodies begin to fail at the cellular level. Vasily Ignatenko dies 2 weeks later. He is buried, like the others, in a coffin lined with lead beneath a slab of concrete because his own body has become radioactive.
He was one of the first of an army.
Over the months and years that followed, the Soviet Union sent more than 600,000 people into this zone to clean it. They were called liquidators. Soldiers, miners, scientists, ordinary conscripts pulled from across the Union. Some of the work was beyond machines. On the roof beside the shattered reactor, the radiation was so intense that the remote-controlled robots sent up to clear the debris simply died. Their circuits scrambled, their motors frozen. So the army used men instead. They called them bio-robots. A liquidator would put on a homemade apron of lead sheeting. He would run onto the roof. He had between 40 and 90 seconds, not minutes, seconds, to seize a shovelful of reactor graphite, hurl it back into the open core, and run. Then the next man, and the next. Thousands of them, each buying a sliver of time with a measured piece of his own future. Above them, helicopter pilots flew again and again over the burning core, dropping sand, clay, lead, and boron to smother the fire below. Around 5,000 tons of it, load by load, through a column of rising heat and radiation. Some of those pilots did not survive the year. And in the end, they won. The fire was buried. By November of 1986, just over 200 days after the explosion, they had built a vast tomb of steel and concrete around the dead reactor. They called it the shelter. The world came to call it the sarcophagus. It was meant to last a few decades. It was thrown up in a hurry by exhausted men over a wound that was still hot. Beneath it, the melted heart of the reactor had cooled into a single black mass, a flow of fuel and sand and concrete that hardened in the basement into a shape the workers named the elephant's foot. It is still there. It will be lethal for longer than human history has so far run. The cost of all this was hidden for as long as the state could hide it. For 2 days, Moscow told the world nothing. The first warning came not from the Soviet Union at all, but from Sweden, where, on the morning of the 28th of April, workers at a nuclear plant near Stockholm set off their own radiation alarms and could not find the leak. The dust on their clothes was not theirs. It had blown across the Baltic from Ukraine. Only then, cornered by the evidence, did the Soviet Union admit that anything had happened at all. Even then, the lie held at home. In Kiev, 100 kilometers downwind, the May Day parade went ahead as planned. Children marching through the streets in the open air while the cloud drifted overhead. To cancel it would have been to admit there was danger. The fallout did not respect the wall, or the border, or the map. The largest share of it, by most estimates around 70%, came down not on Ukraine, but on neighboring Belarus, contaminating nearly a fifth of that country's farmland. It reached further still, into the reindeer pastures of Scandinavia, onto the hill farms of Wales, across half a continent. And the human cost has never been settled. The official Soviet toll counted 31 dead. International bodies studying the long wave of cancers that followed, above all the thyroid cancers in children who drank contaminated milk in those first days, have put the eventual dead in the thousands, and some far higher. The truth is that no one will ever count them exactly. The disaster did not kill all at once. It killed slowly, across years and bodies and borders, in a way that resists any final number.
But the sarcophagus
Was always temporary. Everyone knew it. Cracks opened, rain got in, birds nested in the gaps, and the question of what would happen when it finally failed hung over the zone for 30 years. Remember that question? We will come back to it. For now, leave the reactor behind and look at the land around it. Because the strangest thing about Chernobyl is not what died here, it is what came back. North and west of the plant lies a stretch of forest that the workers gave a grim, accurate name: the Red Forest. On the night of the explosion, the plume of radiation drifted directly over these pines. Within days, the trees turned the color of rust, a deep, dying red. And then they died altogether, an entire forest killed standing. It remains today one of the most contaminated patches of ground on the planet. The poison here is patient. The most troublesome of the elements scattered by the explosion is a form of cesium, and it has what scientists call a half-life of about 30 years, meaning that every 3 decades, only half of it decays away. 40 years on, more than half of the original cesium is still in this soil. Other elements buried here will outlast not only our lives, but our civilizations. In the worst pockets, the ground will not be safe for people to live on for thousands of years. That is why the wall has never come down. The danger did not pass. It settled into the earth and waited. And here, the zone offers up its first real puzzle. You might expect the forest floor here to look the way a forest floor always looks. Leaves falling, rotting, returning to soil, the slow machinery of decay turning death back into life. It does not. In the most contaminated parts of this forest, the dead leaves are not rotting. They are piling up. A team of scientists noticed it years ago and decided to test it properly. They filled hundreds of mesh bags with leaves and left them across the zone, in clean areas and hot ones alike, and came back a year later to weigh what remained. In the uncontaminated places, most of the leaves were gone, eaten away as they should be. In the hottest zones, the leaves were still there, holding most of their weight, barely touched. The reason is small. Smaller than the wolves and the horses everyone photographs. The radiation has thinned out the creatures that do the rotting, the microbes, the fungi, and the insects, the decomposers. Where the radiation is highest, there are fewer bumblebees, fewer butterflies, fewer grasshoppers, fewer spiders stringing webs between the branches. The smallest residents of the zone, the ones whose whole lives are spent in a single patch of poisoned soil, are the ones it has hit hardest. And so the leaves lie where they fall, and the dead wood does not crumble, and year by year the forest floor grows thicker, a slowly building layer of fuel, waiting. It is one of the quiet dangers of the zone. A forest that cannot rot is a forest that will, one day, burn. Remember that too. But step back from the hottest ground, out into the wider zone, and the picture inverts completely. Because here, where the radiation is patchier and the soil less poisoned, life has not retreated. It has flooded in.
When the people left,
The animals arrived, not slowly, not timidly. They poured into the empty space the way water fills a low place. Today, the Chernobyl zone, this supposed wasteland, holds one of the richest concentrations of wildlife anywhere in Europe. More than 200 species of bird, lynx and moose and red deer, wild boar, otters in the rivers, giant catfish gliding through the cooling pond beside the reactor, fat in the still warm water. Brown bears, gone from this region for more than a century, have walked back into it. European bison, the largest land animals on the continent, have been settled here as well, and move in growing herds through clearings that were once farmland. Lynx hunt the overgrown orchards. Eagles nest in the husks of cooling towers. Beavers have dammed the old drainage canals and turned drained fields back into marsh, quietly undoing a century of Soviet engineering in a few wet seasons. And there are wolves. The grey wolves of Chernobyl have become one of the most studied populations on Earth, and what the studies have found is difficult to believe. There are far more of them here than there should be, by some counts, several times the density you would find in a clean, protected nature reserve nearby. They move through the abandoned villages at night. They den in the cellars of empty farmhouses. A team of researchers fitted some of them with special collars that track not only where a wolf goes, but how much radiation it absorbs as it goes there. The numbers were extraordinary. A Chernobyl wolf takes in a dose every single day that is many times the limit a human worker is legally allowed in the same period. It lives its whole life soaked in radiation. And yet the packs are not collapsing, they are thriving. When the scientists looked closer into the wolves' blood, they found something stranger still. Changes in their immune systems, alterations that resemble, of all things, the bodies of human patients undergoing radiation therapy for cancer, as if these animals, generation by generation, were quietly evolving a tolerance for the very thing that should be destroying them. No one is certain yet what it means. It may be that the wolves are simply tough, and the absence of humans matters more to them than the presence of radiation. It may be something deeper. But the question hangs over the whole zone like the plume once did. Why is the most poisoned place in Europe also one of its wildest? The answer the scientists keep returning to is uncomfortable and simple. For wildlife, it turns out, A landscape full of radiation and empty of people is far better than a landscape full of people and free of radiation. The thing these animals were fleeing was never the reactor, it was us. Nowhere is that clearer than with the horses. In 1998, more than a decade after the disaster, someone had an idea. There was a species of wild horse, the Przewalski's horse, native to the steppes of Mongolia, that had been declared extinct in the wild in 1969. It survived only in zoos. A small herd of them was released into the empty zone, almost as an experiment to see whether they could live here.
They did more than live.
They spread. They learned to shelter from the winter inside the abandoned barns and farm buildings, walking in and out of human ruins as if they had always owned them. Cameras left in those barns captured them thousands of times. Today, free herds of these horses, stocky, sand-colored, the last truly wild horses left on Earth, graze across the Chernobyl zone, past the warning signs, through the dead villages, beneath the silent power lines. In Mongolia, their old name means spirit. There is something fitting in that. A species the world had given up on, walking free across a land the world had given up on, each one keeping the other company. The man who knows these animals best is a scientist named Denis Vishnevsky, who has spent his career studying the zone's wild recovery. He calls the return of the horses a small miracle, and he says something about the land itself that is hard to forget. That with the human pressure gone, parts of the zone now look the way Europe looked centuries ago, before the cities, before the farms. Nature, he says, recovers quickly, more quickly than we ever expected. It does not recover unmarked. The radiation leaves its signature on the creatures that live with it, if you know where to look. In the higher dose areas, some of the birds carry a higher rate of cataracts clouding their eyes. Some have measurably smaller brains. And there is a detail that biologists noticed about the frogs. Across most of the world, the eastern tree frog is a vivid, leaf-bright green. In the Chernobyl zone, many of them are not. They are dark, almost black. The pigment that darkens their skin is melanin, the same substance that colors our own, and it does something useful in a place like this. It helps absorb and neutralize radiation. The frogs that happened to be born darker survived a little better. Their darkness was passed on. And so, frog by frog, generation by generation, the zone has been quietly turning its frogs black. Evolution running fast and visible, in real time, in a single human lifetime. And then there are the dogs. When the people of Pripyat were loaded onto the buses, they were told to leave their pets behind. 3 days, after all. The dogs would be fine. But the families never came back, and the animals left chained in the yards and waiting on the doorsteps were not fine. Squads were sent in to shoot them, to stop them carrying contamination out through the wire. Some survived anyway. They bred. They formed packs. Today, hundreds of feral dogs live in the zone, many of them descended from those abandoned pets, running wild around the plant and the empty town. And researchers studying them have found something remarkable. The dogs at the reactor site are now genetically distinct from dogs living only a few miles away. 4 decades inside a closed and separate world, of radiation, of hardship, of breeding only among themselves, has begun to set them apart as a population of their own. The pets left behind on those doorsteps did not just survive. Their descendants became something new. This is the contradiction at the center of Chernobyl, and it does not resolve. The radiation harms. The radiation also, by driving us away, protects. The zone is both the wound and the refuge. Both things are true in the same forest, on the same morning.
And through all of it,
The human story never quite stopped. Because Chernobyl, even at its worst, was never fully abandoned. Someone always had to stay. When the disaster destroyed Reactor 4, it did not destroy the other three. They were too valuable. The Soviet Union needed the power. And so, astonishingly, within months of the explosion, workers were sent back into the plant to restart the surviving reactors and keep them running, generating electricity a few hundred meters from the ruined core, behind the still curing concrete of the sarcophagus. The last of those reactors kept working until December of the year 2000. For 14 years after the worst nuclear accident in history, Chernobyl was still a working power station. People clocked in, people clocked out. They simply did it in one of the most dangerous workplaces on Earth. They could not live in Pripyat anymore, so a new city was built for them, Slavutich, raised from nothing in the months after the disaster, a safe distance to the east. It is a strange and quietly moving place, a town designed entirely to house the survivors of one catastrophe, its districts built by different Soviet republics, each in its own architectural style, a small museum of a country that no longer exists. Every day, the workers of Slavutich board a train and ride it into the zone, through the checkpoints to the plant. And every evening, they ride it back out, to a city built specifically so they would have somewhere to come home to. The commute itself is a monument. A daily journey, decade after decade, in and out of the wound. Because the work never ends. The dead reactor cannot simply be left. It must be watched, measured, cooled, contained, forever. Or for so long that forever is the honest word. Decommissioning a place like this is not a project with a finish line. It is a vigil, and someone has always had to keep it. The plans run far into the future. By the current timetable, the work of fully dismantling the ruined reactor and clearing away its waste is not expected to be finished until around the year 2065, nearly 80 years after the night it exploded. A child born in Slavutich today could give an entire working life to Chernobyl and still not see the end of it. Some of the engineers who will finally close the book on this place have not yet been born. That is the true scale of what happened here. Not a disaster that ended, but one that has to be managed by hand, by people, across generations. A job handed down like an inheritance from the liquidators of 1986 to the children of the workers who ride the train today. It is the longest cleanup in human history, and it is not yet half done. There is one more structure in the zone that almost no one was meant to see. Deep in the forest near the plant stands a wall of steel, a lattice of girders and antennae rising taller than a 50-story building, stretching nearly a kilometer across the trees. It is one of the largest structures ever built in Ukraine, and for most of its life, it did not officially exist. This is Duga, an over-the-horizon radar built by the Soviet military in the Cold War to watch for incoming missiles from across the world. It broadcast a strange rhythmic tapping that bled into radios across the planet. Pilots and radio operators on every continent heard it for years and had no idea what it was. They nicknamed the unknown signal the Russian woodpecker. And here is the thing the world got wrong about Chernobyl for a long time. People assumed the great secret of this place was the reactor, the accident, the cover-up, the lie about 3 days. But the reactor was, in the end, a known thing, an admitted thing. Duga was different. On the official Soviet maps, the spot where this colossal antenna stood was marked as something else entirely. A children's summer camp. The largest secret in the zone was hidden not behind a wall of concrete, but behind a label. The maps simply said it wasn't there. For most of its life, the zone was closed to everyone but the workers, the scientists, and the old returners. But slowly, carefully, that began to change. In 2011, Ukraine opened the exclusion zone to visitors, guided, monitored, carrying dosimeters, walking fixed paths through the ruins. A trickle became a stream. And in 2019, when a television series carried the story of the disaster to millions who had never known its details, the stream became a flood. More than 100,000 people came in a single year to stand in the silent square in Pripyat, to photograph the rusting wheel, to feel the strange weight of the place for themselves. The government began to imagine more. New routes, a hotel, museums, a plan to draw as many as 1 million visitors a year, to turn the great wound of the 20th century into a place of memory and pilgrimage. The most contaminated land in Europe was, improbably, becoming a destination, a place people crossed the world to see. The zone keeps its secrets that way, quietly, behind quiet. And for 30 years after the disaster, that quiet held. The samosely grew old. The animals multiplied. The workers rode their train. The sarcophagus crumbled slowly over the elephant's foot, and engineers from 45 nations gathered to solve the problem everyone had been putting off. The problem of what to do when the old shelter finally failed. Their answer was the largest movable structure ever built by human hands. They called it the new safe confinement, an arch of steel as tall as a cathedral and wider than a football pitch, high enough to cover the Statue of Liberty, heavy as a battleship. They built it on rails, beside the reactor, a safe distance away, so that no worker would have to labor directly over the radioactive core. And then, in 2016, they slid the entire thing, all 36,000 tons of it, along the tracks and lowered it gently over the old sarcophagus, sealing the wound beneath a second, vaster shell. It cost more than 2 billion euros. 45 countries paid for it. It was finished in 2019, and it was built, the engineers promised, to stand for 100 years. A century of safety. A century in which the dangerous work of finally dismantling the reactor underneath could be carried out, slowly, by machines, in the shelter of the arch. 100 years. That was the promise. Remember the question we left behind at the old sarcophagus? What happens when the shell finally fails? The world had answered it. It had spent a fortune and the labor of dozens of nations to make sure that, for the rest of this century at least, the answer would be nothing. The shell would not fail. The arch would hold. And then, 3 years later, the war came. It is the early morning of the 24th of February, 2022. Russian forces are pouring across the border from Belarus, driving south toward Kiev. And the shortest road to Kiev runs directly through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. By the end of that first day, Russian troops have seized the plant. They take the staff. Inside the control rooms and corridors of the most sensitive nuclear site on the continent, the workers who keep the vigil are now hostages, held at gunpoint, ordered to keep doing the one job that cannot stop. The man in charge of the shift that morning is named Valentin Heiko. He is not a young man. He is a foreman, an engineer who has spent his life inside this plant. And he is one of a small, vanishing number of people who can say they were here in 1986 too. He was a liquidator. He helped clean up the disaster as a younger man, and nearly 4 decades later, he is still here, on duty, when the soldiers walk in. This is the man we have been waiting to meet, the one who was here at the beginning. Because of the war, the workers cannot leave. The city of Slavutic, where the next shift lives, is cut off by the fighting. The train cannot run. And so the crew that happens to be on duty when the invasion begins simply stays. They cannot go home. They cannot be relieved. Valentin Heiko and his shift work for nearly a month without rest, somewhere near 600 hours, sleeping on desks and chairs and floors, rationing food, monitoring the reactors and the radiation and the wounded sarcophagus through the long days of occupation. They negotiate with their captors. They keep the plant alive. And a strange truth settles over the occupation. The Russian soldiers have the guns, but the Ukrainians have the knowledge. In a place like this, knowledge is the only thing that keeps everyone breathing. The occupiers need the engineers to tell them where it is safe to stand, which gave the men being held hostage a quiet, terrible leverage. They were prisoners, and they were also the only people in the building who understood the danger surrounding them all. Not everyone understood it. Some of the Russian troops dug trenches and fortifications directly into the Red Forest, the most contaminated ground in the entire zone, the rust-colored woodland where the dead leaves never rot and the radiation lies thickest in the soil. They dug into it. They lived in it. They kicked the buried poison up into the air and breathed it. Within weeks, soldiers were being taken across the border to a hospital in Belarus with the signs of radiation sickness. The forest that could not rot had its own way of answering the men who disturbed it. The occupation lasted a little over a month. At the end of March 2022, the Russian forces withdrew from the zone and handed the plant back to its exhausted Ukrainian staff. Valentin Heiko and his crew had held the line. The reactors were stable. The vigil somehow had not broken. But the war did not leave Chernobyl behind. It came back. In the small hours of the 14th of February 2025, the international inspectors stationed at the plant heard an explosion. A drone, armed with a warhead, had struck the roof of the new safe confinement. The Great Arch, the 100-year shell, the most expensive nuclear safety structure ever built. It tore a hole more than 500 square feet across and started a fire that smoldered inside the structure's skin for days. At first, the damage looked survivable. The radiation monitors held steady. The fire was put out. But in the months that followed, the inspectors delivered a verdict that landed like a stone.
The arch can no longer do the one thing it was built to do.
Its confinement function is gone. The shell that was supposed to seal the reactor for a century, finished only 6 years earlier, has lost the ability to contain what lies beneath it. 40 years after the explosion, the wound at the center of Chernobyl is open to the sky again. Repairs have stalled. The fighting goes on. And scientists have begun to warn of something almost unthinkable, that the damaged inner structures, no longer protected, could one day collapse and lift the old contamination back into the air. This is the hardest truth of the zone, and there is no comfort to soften it. The world spent 30 years and the wealth of nations learning to hold Chernobyl still, to bury it, to make the most dangerous place on Earth boring and safe and quiet. And in a single night, a single weapon undid the heart of that work. The vigil that men like Valentin Heiko have kept since 1986, that the firefighters died for, that the liquidators bled for, is harder now than it has been in a generation. And still, the people stay. The samosely are nearly gone now. Age has done what radiation and soldiers and warnings could not. Where there were 1,200 returners, then a few hundred, then a handful, today perhaps 100 remain, scattered across the villages and the town of Chernobyl itself, most of them women, most of them past their 80th year. The youngest among them were middle-aged when the reactor exploded. The line that began on that April night is gently reaching its end. When the last of them is gone, something will close that no monument can reopen. The living memory of these villages, of weddings and harvests and ordinary winters, of the land before it became a symbol, walks around now in a few pairs of old shoes, tends a few last gardens, and will not be replaced. 900 deaths, 1 birth. A community that chose, against every instruction, to end where it began. Ivan Semenyuk, in his house in Pripyat, was once asked whether he was afraid of the radiation. He was not. He had lived through worse, he said, than something he could not see. The hunger of his childhood was real. The war was real. This invisible thing in the soil, he had made his peace with it long ago. He wanted only to die at home, in his own house, on his own ground. To most of the returners, that was never a strange wish. It was the most ordinary wish in the world. And when they are gone, the zone will not be empty. It was never empty. The wolves will still move through Pripyat at night. The horses will still shelter in the barns. The black frogs will still sing in the marshes, a little darker each generation. The forest will keep refusing to rot, and the dead leaves will keep piling up, and the great arch will stand over the buried reactor, wounded now, watched by a handful of exhausted engineers who ride a train each morning into a place the world was told no one could go. We drew a line around Chernobyl and called the inside of it uninhabitable. For 40 years, the people who live there have been quietly proving that we used the wrong word. Uninhabitable and uninhabited are not the same thing. One is a measurement, the other is a choice. The zone is dangerous, that has never been in doubt, but it is not lifeless. It may, in its strange and poisoned way, be more full of life than it has been in 100 years. The babushka in the cottage with the blue gate did not stay because the radiation was harmless. She knew it was not. She stayed because this was the table where her mother served bread, and that was the field where her husband is buried. And out there beyond the fence was a world that had already decided she did not belong in it. She stayed because home, for some people, is not a place you can be talked out of, even when the place is trying, slowly, to kill you, even when the whole world agrees you should go. So when you picture Chernobyl, do not picture an empty wasteland frozen on the day everyone ran. Picture the kettle boiling. Picture the wolf in the silent street and the wild horse grazing past the warning sign, and the old man keeping bees in a village of 3. Picture the engineer who was here in 1986 and was still here when the soldiers came, standing his ground in the dark. The wall is still there. The danger is still there. The war is not over, and the arch can no longer hold what it was built to hold. And inside all of it, against every measurement, against every order, against the patient effort of the radiation itself, something is still alive in the zone, still waking, still here. Thank you for spending this time with us inside the wall. Until the next journey,